is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
All right, welcome back to Arlington. We are live from Big 12 Media Days. John Kurtz with Cole Manbeck here from the Three-Mont crew, and we have Big 12 Deputy Commissioner Tim Weiser, former athletic director at K-State, with us. We are very excited to chat with him, and of course, all our coverage here and all our coverage all the time on Three-Mont is brought to you by our friends at Holiday Distillery. Make sure you get your Ben Holiday bottled and bond bourbon, your 360 vodka for your tailgates, you're hanging out at the lake this summer, whatever it is, they've got you covered. Great K-State folks that help support us here on the pod, so make sure that you support them as well. So, we have found a friendly face here. I know Cole, Tim, has met you before. This is my first time meeting you, but as a diehard K-State fan growing up, it's great to meet you.
Well, that's very kind of you. It's my pleasure to join you guys today. Anytime we can spend time talking about K-State, it's a good day for me.
Yeah, well, we'll talk plenty about K-State. I'm curious, life in the new Big 12 as the Big 12 Deputy Commissioner. How is that going working with Brady Olmar?
It's been such an unbelievable change from what I've known the conference to be for the past 14, 15 years that I've been there. But frankly, as I look back on this first year with Brett, I think a lot of the change that we've experienced was probably something that we needed. He brought in a completely different perspective, having not worked in the space, and he really kind of challenged us to explain why we did what we do. And some of the times our answers weren't really very good, at least in my way of thinking, other than we've just always done it that way. And that's not usually a great answer. So there's been so many things that I found myself going, I don't know why we wouldn't have thought about doing it that way. This pro day idea that I think you guys have probably heard about, that's one that we should have years ago been thinking about the potential benefits there. But I think that's part of the reason the board made the choice they did to hire Brett, because he represented completely different perspective, and it's paid off for us. I really think we're a better conference today because of the things that he's done for us this past year. And who knows what the future holds, but I guess I really like our chances now because we've got a great group of schools, potentially maybe adding schools down the road. But his vision and his idea of what a conference office should be doing, I think is a healthy one for us. So it's a long answer, but that's kind of where we find ourselves.
Yeah, well, it seems like one of his biggest strengths has been obviously the marketing piece of this. And the reputation of the conference has just completely changed in the last 2 years. Yep. I mean, take us into like what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, what he's doing there.
Yeah, and I think that theme, we heard it last year when he talked about a cooler, hipper, younger conference, and I think all of us kind of looked around at what does that really mean? What does that really say we're going to be about? And I think what I've learned is, in his mind, the conference should be a part of the decision that kids make as to where they go. And of course, that would have not ever been a perspective I would have had, because I always believed that kids make choices based on coach, school, facilities. Now, a lot of that's changed. And I was up in Omaha for the College World Series, and I listened to a lot of the coaches and ADs up there that said, not only is it not about me as a coach or our facilities, it's primarily about how much and how soon can I get money. And that dynamic has changed so much of what we do. And in the conference office, I think him continue to try and drive the narrative of, hey, this is a conference that is going to do things differently. And we're going to be about more of what the youth are thinking about and looking for when it comes to making a choice about where they continue their education.
What are your thoughts on realignment looking forward and also looking back, Tim? I mean, you were AD at K-State 2001, 2008, and looking at how the landscape has just completely changed. I mean, the Big 12 had a perfect league from a geographic footprint, and so many things have changed. What are your thoughts on what's transpired and now looking ahead into the future?
Well, I could talk for hours on that because, I'd be lying if I said that there wasn't a number of times that I found myself really discouraged and disappointed about not just the decisions that were made, but how they were made. And it felt at times a little bit like we had been betrayed. But then as time's passed, and I've spent more time looking back on it, there was some decision making that Texas and certainly Oklahoma most recently made that maybe if I were in their shoes, I would have had to think about and consider I continue to maintain that the choice Texas made wasn't a financial one, because we all know what Texas resources are like. I think theirs was more about affiliating with a group of schools that on a given Saturday, they would rather get beat by Alabama than they would Kansas State or Florida than Iowa State. Or, that I think was really what was driving the way they looked out down the road. And in Oklahoma's case, I'm not as convinced that that was the issue for them. I think they were more of what I would call the reluctant bride that kind of felt like, wow, if we don't go, what happens to the Texas OU football game, basketball, all the things that we know from an OU and Texas standpoint are really important. So I kind of felt like if I was in Oklahoma's case, it would have been hard for me not to think about the long term, and don't we want to be affiliated with Texas and now these other schools? I think time will tell, but you look at Missouri, it's hard to really say that they've benefited from a competitive standpoint. Nebraska, I don't know that you could make the argument that they benefited from a competitive. They probably have both benefited financially, but Colorado, clearly they haven't benefited from the Pac-12. A&M may be the one school that probably could make the best argument about they've benefited from it, but the motivation they had to leave was exclusively about getting away from Texas, and now here they are in a year right back in the same situation. So that's a long way of saying, the past has it's ebbed and flowed for me in terms of how I look at it. But going forward, I think, I'd be shocked if we don't add additional members at some point in the future. And I don't think it's as much about whether it's 2 more, 4 more, 6 more, 1 more. I think it's really going to be driven more by what schools are available. And if they can really benefit us from a TV contract standpoint to where we can get an additional pro rata share because of that particular school joining, I think that's going to be part of it. I think there is some desire to look west and try and recognize that you've got a BYU now, that maybe it makes some sense for us to have a travel partner in or around that location. So if I were betting, I would tell you I think it's more likely than not that we'll add additional schools in the future.
What are your thoughts, Tim, on basketball-only schools as well? And like a Gonzaga, I don't want to get you to name schools individually, but I'm thinking like a Gonzaga, UConn, potentially, that have been basketball powers, and maybe their value that they might bring to a league that maybe has been understated in college athletics?
Yeah, so, the first thing I would tell you is, the one thing that I don't think we're lacking for in this league is good basketball. I think we've got the best basketball of any conference. Now, does that mean you shouldn't consider adding and getting even stronger? No. I think you probably should think about those things. But the way to this point, the TV contracts have always viewed football and basketball is for every dollar that they provide a conference, they've typically suggested 75 cents of it is driven by football. So to add somebody with basketball only from that standpoint may not make a lot of sense. Now, maybe the mistake we've been making all these years is having a negotiation that includes football and basketball. And perhaps the time's come where we say, hey, when we renew our contract in 7 years, 5 years, we're going to separate the football out from the basketball because we think basketball should be 50 cents of the dollar as opposed to 25. Then maybe it does make sense to do that. But the problem with any school like a Gonzaga, if it was just basketball, I suppose you could make some financial sense of that, men's and women's basketball, but that's not what those schools are looking for. They want all their other sports to join too, and then the existing schools are saying, wow, flying my baseball team, softball team, volleyball team, whatever it might be, all that way and miss that much class time and spend that much money, and it gets to be hard to make sense of it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to ask about, the way things have been kind of pitted in the media, it's like this Big 12 versus Pac-12 sort of adversarial relationship. What is that like actually behind closed doors within the league?
Yeah, it's funny because it felt like for the past 3 or 4 years, it was always about the Big 12 being sort of, are they going to make it? Are they going to survive? What are they doing? What's happening? And in the matter of, it seems like months, the narrative has flipped so much to the Pac-12. What are they doing? Are they going to survive? Are schools going to? So, there's a part of us that lived through when we were in the barrel going, it's kind of nice to have another conference try and defend themselves on all fronts. In terms of, how it feels day to day in our office, I got to tell you, the ADs that I'm friends with in the Pac-12, I don't know that any of them are necessarily feeling like it's our attempt to undermine what they're doing. I think it's more about recognizing that if something happens out there and there's a decision that they no longer feel like it makes sense to associate with that group of schools financially, geographically, that here's an option that is worth thinking about and considering. And so that's how I think most of the time the conversations have been going. I can't speak to what Brett and George, the two commissioners, may have shared over the past year, but clearly they're in a different spot than the Pac-12 has been in a long time, and trying to understand what their new TV media rights deal seems to be one of the great secrets of college athletics right now. Nobody seems to know exactly what they do or don't have. What I tell people is I just know that if we had something really good to talk about from a media rights standpoint, we'd be screaming it at the top of every mountain we could find. And sometimes that silence suggests the opposite. So I think it'll be interesting to see when media days take place, how that plays out and exactly what happens there in terms of their announcements.
Yeah, I've got just one more. Now, this has been great. I love talking conference realignment here, and I do want to get to K-State. But the last thing I would ask is just, everyone's chasing the Big Ten and the SEC financially right now, and I know Brett just said at the podium we don't want to think about trying to compete with other conferences. But what do you guys view as a realistic kind of financial ceiling in terms of a payout for each team, or how close you could get to that number, or just how that's going to shake out?
Boy, financial ceiling. I'm not sure there is such a thing. I really, in my 40 years in this profession, it has never been about pulling back on revenues. There have been times where we've had to pull back on expenses, but it's always been about spending more, building more, paying more. And now when you throw in the NIL piece, I just think it's going to continue to go. I'm trying to remember what we were getting from the Big 12 when I was at Kansas State. I want to say it was in the 8 to 10 million a year.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so look at, that's 15 years ago. Here we are distributing in the 40s, and what the SEC and the Big Ten are spending or distributing is even more. I'm not sure. It's going to be hard for anybody to catch up to the Big Ten and the SEC. There's just so many advantages they have in terms of eyeballs and competitive success and network opportunities. I think it'll be difficult, but that doesn't mean we still can't be in a good place. If it was always about who spends the most money, Texas should be winning championships in every sport, and they don't, because it's more than just about money. So I think that's why you see the K-States and the TCU. Those are the stories that I really enjoy, and that's probably why I enjoyed my time at Kansas State, because it was, we all knew what our resources were and weren't, but man, that didn't keep our kids from wanting to compete and our coaches from working hard. And when you had that success and got those championships, it seemed all the more special.
As a K-State fan, obviously realignment has been scary at times,
No
and
question.
where they're going to end up potentially. And now it certainly feels a lot better to not be the hunted anymore as a K-State fan. But what do you think a school like K-State's value is from a national? People like to say flyover country, stuff like that. Manhattan, Kansas, not a huge population, but they've been successful.
Yep.
K-State has won, and how much does that matter
Absolutely.
when it comes to the money aspect?
I think that is the most important thing. Can you change your location? The perception of it being a flyover state has existed since I was born and raised in Kansas. It's just part of the narrative, but it sure hasn't hurt KU from a basketball standpoint. and it hasn't hurt Kansas State from a football, basketball, you name it. So I think, there's probably a little bit too much placed on that piece of it, and it should be more about the competitive piece of it. I got to believe Washington State and Oregon State are sitting there feeling a lot like Iowa State and Kansas State and Oklahoma State felt a few years ago, because there's the same kinds of issues in those institutions and cities that we were dealing with. So you kind of have to move past that and talk about, okay, we're not going to be able to do and change anything on that front, but that shouldn't keep us from winning championships and going to bowl games and going to the NCAA tournament and all the things that we've seen K-State do.
Hypothetical question. Had Bill Snyder won a national championship, which he was right on the doorstep multiple times, do you think that would have changed the way K-State is viewed in terms of market value, having had that next to their name in a sport like college football?
I think it would have for a period of time. I think you could even probably grab people in here and say, hey, who won the national championship last year? People's memories don't last as long as you think, whether that's football, basketball, whatever. So, yeah, it probably would have mattered for a time that K-State was able to say we won a national championship in football. But if you continue to then go back to winning conference championships, but you didn't get back into a championship game again, I'm not sure it would have. Maybe the local donations or the school would have benefited, but I'm not sure there would have been the national narrative at that point.
Yeah, well, I think it's very true, unfortunately, and we wish that K-State obviously could have gotten there.
Hey,
but
there's still a future now.
Yeah,
right?
there is.
And I got to tell you, I feel very good about Coach. I just think he's such a great fit, and watching how his team performed last year, I'm bullish. I guess it's the purple blood that still runs through me, but I'm very bullish on K-State football and basketball and the sports that they're successful in like that. So who knows what the future may hold. We may have yet more fun in front of us here.
Well, that's the funny thing. You say you feel good about Coach. That could be speaking to
Which
either
one?
football or men's basketball
question.
right now with how things are going.
There's no question.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here.
Sure.
What is your best or favorite Bill Snyder story? It's a good peek behind the curtains at what working with Bill Snyder was like.
Wow, boy. Favorite Bill Snyder story. Oh my gosh. The story that I'm sure all of you have heard preceded me about the 2 pads of butter versus, that story I still find myself smiling when I think about. But, I can think of so many times that I would be visiting with Bill about maybe not a football specific issue, but a department issue that we were dealing with, basketball maybe. I can't remember what the topic would be, but it always felt like I was talking with somebody who was more than just a football coach, that he really cared about the rest of the department and the success that they had. And, the drama that I went through at the Fiesta Bowl with L. Roberson and the difficulties that created, I remember being criticized by some of the local media in Phoenix because I allowed Bill Snyder to have basically the ability to determine what he felt like was the right way to handle L, because it really, at the end of the day, it turned out to be a curfew violation more than what, at the time, the law enforcement people would have suggested. And I said at that time, and I still believe it today, how can you trust a coach with a football program that has done what ours has done, and then when you have this challenge, say, yeah, but I don't trust you now? You can't do that. And in the end, we made as good of a situation as I think we could have, considering the circumstances. But that story, I tell you, because of how I felt across the years I was there, Bill handled situations and talked to me about what he thought in this given situation and the politics on campus or whatever it might have been. So those stories maybe don't bring a smile to your face, but I'm going to tell you, as an AD that was constantly worried about the next dollar and trying to figure out how we were going to do this and that, it was comforting to have somebody that you knew was looking beyond just the football program.
What was it like for you in your perspective when you start hearing, hey, he may want to retire, and you're thinking about not only like the crazy prospect of trying to replace him, but also like what's happening in the moment, and just what were your emotions when you found out?
Oh, it was certainly anxiety at the highest level, because I just couldn't imagine a future without Bill Snyder. But as we know, nothing lasts forever, and we all have expiration dates. And the first time he and I had a discussion about it, it was on the heels, can't remember what season, but we finished the year. I think we didn't go to a bowl that year. We lost to Nebraska, I think, at the end of the year. And I knew his frustration level was exceedingly high about how the year went. And so when we talked about it just shortly after the season ended, I was convinced that it was more about his current frustration with the season that just finished. And so I encouraged him to take some time and really make sure that this is something that isn't just about the past season. And to his credit, he came back a few weeks later, and it was, yeah, you're right, I'm ready to go. And it was about the season, so I'm ready to turn the page and move on to the next. Well, of course, I was relieved to hear that. I wasn't interested in January looking for a new football coach, but it planted the seed for me that, there's a day coming. Maybe it's not going to be for a couple of years, but it's closer than what I thought. And that created, a different mindset for me in terms of how I was going to proceed over the coming months, years, and figure out what our next step was going to be.
We'll get you out of here in just a few minutes,
No,
Tim.
it's good.
Thank
Good.
you so much for the time.
Sure.
You're incredibly gracious with it. When Bill did retire in 2005, did you get any sense that he immediately regretted it in the aftermath or anything?
No. I stayed in touch with him occasionally, and we would talk about how he was spending his days, but I knew full well that even though he thought, and you guys remember the comments that he made about an opportunity to become a better husband and a father, the things that in my mind were exactly true about how he was feeling. But I also knew at the time, for a guy who was 24/7 on football, and it didn't matter what time of the year, he was in the office, he was watching film, he was doing, you don't go from that to zero and not have some, what's happening here? What am I doing? I just think it's natural for any coach, and it's too bad that our profession doesn't provide for sabbaticals like higher education does, because I think ADs, head coaches, would be benefited by having a year to kind of start thinking about how this will work and how I will make adjustments to it, because it's not just Bill, but I've seen this happen with so many coaches and how they handle a life outside of their head coaching duty. It's tough. It's tough for him, and I knew Bill was going to experience that same experience.
What was it like for you watching him turn it around a second time and coming back?
Who could be surprised after what he did the first time? Honestly, he had more resources and more of an opportunity the second time than he did the first time. I think, even though it wouldn't have been easy either time, that first time, there was no success to build on. It was kind of the desert, and he was trying to construct an oasis there with no vision of how could he possibly do that. Well, when he came back the second time, I just didn't think there was any way he wasn't going to be able to flip the mindset and the narrative of the kids, and of course the fans. You knew that they were going to be right back front and center. But again, as much as we want to think everything will last forever, it can't. And we have to have a little bit of a reality check when it comes to knowing that there's a future.
Well, I know that the timing of this question, not the greatest. He's going through some tough times right now, but I look back on it and think one of the most significant hires that K-State has made in the last 20, 30 years was hiring Bob Huggins for the men's basketball program to jumpstart that, and everything that's come after that seems to be, you can trace it back to the momentum that program got there. What was that time like in making that hire?
Yeah, boy, that's another one I could talk hours on. So what bothered me most about the current state of our basketball program at that time is it felt like we had reached a point within our fan base that close losses were okay. Moral victories were, that's okay. And, the proud tradition that K-State had was really rooted more in basketball historically than it was in football. And I remember the Jack Hartman days and the success that he had. And, it really bothered me that we had gotten to the point where we were okay with that kind of place. So when we made the decision to make a change, I had Eddie Fogler, who had, of course, been the head coach at Wichita State and Vanderbilt and South Carolina, and I had a long-time relationship with him. And I said, Eddie, look, I'm willing to consider anything and everything. We need to get this thing done right. And so Greg McDermott was somebody that we thought about, and frankly, I knew Greg and felt like from a fit standpoint, he would have been a great fit at Kansas State. But before I could get too far down the path, pretty sure it was Iowa State that made the choice to hire him. I think he was at Northern Iowa maybe at that time.
Yep.
So kind of felt like, okay, well, that would have been what I considered to be a good fit for us, but let's see what else. So Eddie calls me, and he says, I need you to be open-minded. And I said, what does that mean? He said, I just want you to trust me. I've got somebody I want you to meet and spend time talking to. And I said, okay, who's that? And he said, Bob Huggins. And I said, no way. There's absolutely no way. That is not an option. He said, no, I don't really think you know him. Just spend an hour with him. And so Eddie and I'm trying to think who else might have been with me, went to Indianapolis and spent a good, what was supposed to be a couple hours, turned into 4 hours. And I peppered Bob with some really difficult questions about how it ended at Cincinnati, the DUI, all. And to his credit, he owned it all. He didn't back away from any part of it, didn't blink on any of these questions, and he was so engaging. And I thought, if ever there was a time I could roll the dice and take a chance, now is it. The K-State basketball program deserved that kind of a roll of the dice. I was at a point in my career where I felt like I could take that chance. And honestly, I probably wasn't as prepared for what that did from an immediate jump start, I think was the way you put it, and how all of a sudden he was the mayor of Aggieville, or, all the different things that came along, and the immediate interest from our fans. And I was so unprepared for that kind of immediate reaction. I knew he'd win. You don't win as many basketball games. It was just how we were going to manage this and how we were going to get through it. And then, of course, it ended way too soon for my benefit. But I also knew when I talked with him about it, hey, I made the choice to come to Kansas State because it was home. Why shouldn't he have the same opportunity to go back home to West Virginia? And so I kind of understood it. It took me a couple of years to get to the point where I wasn't as bitter about it. But, given what Frank then quickly was able to do, it kind of felt like Bob's fingerprints were still on the program, and he was still benefiting our basketball futures. And I would have to agree with you. I felt like it was a seminal moment for K-State basketball in terms of getting back that interest, that pride, that belief that we're more than just moral victories here, and close losses aren't acceptable. And so now to see how things are going for him, it kind of breaks my heart. I certainly don't know all the circumstances, but I went to his induction last September into the Basketball Hall of Fame, and we had such great conversation, and I sensed at that point that he wasn't far from retirement, but he's an exact duplicate of Bill when it comes to, you don't turn that world off and expect that it's going to end easily and smoothly either. And so part of this, I just wonder if it's rooted in what am I going to do? That's all I've known, and this is my alma mater, and this is my home. So, I hope things sort themselves out for the good, but that doesn't diminish what I think was the right thing for Kansas State basketball when we hired him.
I'm so glad you hired him, because growing up, I took a lot of pride in K-State basketball, but I'd never seen him win. And it's so much fun to watch what Bramlage Coliseum has become, and the atmospheres and the winning atmosphere that's been developed. 3 Elite Eight since you hired him, just the fun at Jerome Tang. It changed the culture of K-State basketball and the fan base. The apathy was gone. So I'm so glad you hired him. Did you get a sense that, how conflicted do you think Huggs was when you talked to him and President Weefald about leaving, when you had conversations?
Oh, I think he was really struggling with it. I remember specifically him saying, Jerry West was calling me saying, you got to come home. You got to come home. How do you say to Jerry West, no, I don't want to come home? And I thought, yeah, I understand that. But, we took a lot of criticism when we hired him for giving him a second chance. And in some ways, it kind of felt like, so we got both the front end that we got beat up on, and now because you're leaving early, we're getting beat up on the back end. But at the time, it still felt like he had done for our basketball program and got us to a point where, okay, we can take those couple of years and build on it and maybe keep that momentum going. And credit to Frank Martin and what he did, that happened. So, I can't tell you that there's any part of that decision I regret. There isn't. I'm glad we made that choice. Clearly it was a risk. But, I tell people that one thing I've learned about hiring anybody, coaches, administrators, whatever, sometimes, not always, but sometimes people on their second chance are better bets than people on their first chance.
Yep.
And I felt like, at least at that time with Bob, he knew what we had in the way of expectations from a behavioral standpoint, how we wanted the program running. And frankly, Manhattan felt to me like a good place for him to re-enter the coaching profession and try and build back, his legacy from what it was at Cincinnati before it all kind of went south on him.
Fun one for me, and John may remember this. I was on the KSU message boards back in the day when you were going through the hiring process for Bob Huggins. People that don't know, you're an avid hunter, fisherman, outdoorsman. Is it true that there was a Cabela's gift card presented to you to hire Bob Huggins as appreciation, a token of appreciation?
Yes, it is true. And I will tell you, I still enjoy that shotgun more than any other shotgun that I have. So, yeah, but that's the part that so caught me off guard is it just felt like there was so much pent-up interest and demand for K-State basketball to matter again. And I knew that for me, I knew that was the case, but I had no idea it was to the extent that it turned out to be from the fan base.
Yeah.
While your sources are good, I didn't think very many people knew that story.
It was on the message boards too.
Whoever that came from, man.
Wow, sorry to put you on the spot with that one, but
no. I do remember that, and they knew exactly what mattered to me. Cabela's was my go-to place.
They put in their research on that, and if I were you, I'd get that shotgun put up because that hire is what changed the culture at K-State basketball. And as I think about it, I have such a great appreciation for you in doing that because, I'm sure you take a sense of pride now in watching K-State basketball and where the program has gone.
No, there's
since.
no question. And what Jerome's done, I went and watched them beat Kentucky last year, and watching how many fans were there supporting them and how all of a sudden now here's K-State basketball on the same stage with Kentucky basketball and beating them. Right. It's like, so I do take pride, but I tell you that those years that I had at K-State, certainly there were some down times. The L. Roberson story that I mentioned to you, there were some things that were difficult, but there isn't anybody that works as an AD at any school that's not going to experience some of those down moments. But in the big scheme of things, I had way more good things happen to me, and I was blessed beyond measure in my time there. It was really a great experience, and so I'm hoping to spend more time in Manhattan as time goes on and get back and hopefully get that shotgun out and start shooting some more pheasants.
I've got one more, and I know this is terrible order in how we did the questions here. We should have finished with what we did before I asked this, but you've been so open, and I just appreciate your candor in all this. How do you reflect on the Ron Prince hire and just what that was like trying to replace that's an unenviable task for anybody to try and make that hire.
Well, obviously it was disappointing how that played out. I knew, and John Weefald, God rest his soul, knew that choice was a risky one. And partly is because he had never been a head coach. Anytime you hire somebody that's not had head coaching experience, there's an element of risk there. So what I struggled with more was how it ended for me because, my time there, I was hopeful that Ron was going to be able to continue to grow in his head coaching experience and that he'd rely on a great staff, which, by the way, he had some great coordinators there. But what I wasn't as prepared for is his management of staff, how he dealt with kids, left a lot of disappointment for me. And then, at the end, I was starting to see signs where I'm not sure this is going to get better. And the only worst thing to do if you've made one mistake is to make a second mistake. And so I was convinced that we hadn't seen enough to really warrant an extension and a new contract. And others felt differently at the university level. And so I just didn't feel like I could, in good conscience, continue to be the athletic director there and take responsibility for a football coach, staff, program that I wasn't convinced was going to lead us to the right place. And, I wanted to finish my career at Kansas State. There's no two ways about it. That was the reason I took that job, was to finish up there. But it was the right thing for me to leave. It was the right thing for K-State to find somebody else. And maybe they saw the Ron Prince thing in a way that I would never see it. But it was time for me to go. And I don't regret my time in the conference office. Had a great experience there too. But yeah, that would have been yet another one of the disappointments from my time at Kansas State.
Yeah. Well, let's end on a high here. What are your favorite spots in Manhattan that you missed from back in the day?
Well, I can think of some really good dove spots that I used to go out and shoot dove with a lot of good guys there, Kelly Briggs and some of the others that I spent time with. That's the part that I probably enjoyed as much about Manhattan, was the outdoors and just the opportunity to hunt and fish. And of course, I still had family in Great Bend at that time and could get out there easily to see my mom and my sisters. And so all of that added up to, a great fit for me. My kids would say, even though my son was born in Tennessee and my daughter was born in Wichita, Kansas, I think they would both say home is Manhattan. I think they would both feel like that was their home, which gives me great comfort. Of all the places we've lived, I'm glad that they can say that Manhattan is their home. So there's a lot for me to be thankful for, but great place, great people, and of course the future's very bright with what Gene's done and the coaching hires that he's made, and I'm excited for the football season to get here.
Hey, let's do it. We'd love to see you there for a game.
Looking forward to it, guys.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, Tim, for doing this.
My pleasure.